Next up is Dr. Praveen Kumar, Geoscience, Hydrology. He'll be talking about the critical zone observatories. There you go.
Okay. Is this a good place to stand? Okay. So my name is Praveen Kumar. I'm going to just present the first 1/3 or maybe a quarter of these slides to talk about the science, and then my colleague Luigi is going to talk about the technology associated with it. So Kenton said I should talk a little bit more about the science, so you guys have a little fun. So no data for my part. So I lead a project called Critical Zone Observatory. It is located in this IML. So this is part of a network of observatories across the country. We are in the 6th year of operation in the second phase. And the first phase was varied from 3 to 5 years. And we have been working with 3 sites, one in Illinois, Upper Sangamon, which is about half an hour drive from Champaign, another one in Iowa, and one in Minnesota. So the question then you want to ask is, what the heck is critical zone? And the critical zone term was coined in 2001 in a National Research Council report. And it came about because the way we study the near surface environment of the Earth, both above and below the ground, had been divided variously into hydrology, geomorphology, geology, biogeochemistry, ecology, you name it. And what was realized was that all these systems essentially work together rather than in a piecemeal disciplinary way. And so the idea here with these observatories is to look across scales, from molecular scale to complexes to aggregates to columns going up to the watershed scale, and understand how our near Earth system functions. The term critical comes from the realization that this is the environment that supports life, terrestrial life, by and large, and therefore it is critical for the support of the terrestrial life. To give you an example of how complex this is a picture from an experimental site in China, which was there about 3 or 4 years ago. And what these guys were doing is they created a bay, rows of bay, and they had the same soil but different plants, okay, different vegetation, going from bare to different vegetation types. And so this is a raised platform. And so it rains, these plants grow, and they collect the water down below these. And what they do is they direct this water in 5 different bays. And what you can see is that the microbiota that is supported naturally by the water that is coming out from these plants is different. Okay, so the interaction between plants, the root system, the soil creates a water environment that supports different organisms. And so a lot of the things that we see around in the streams that is flowing is shaped by a pretty complex process that goes up from the chemistry of the rain to the biogeochemistry and so forth. So the goal is to try and understand what happens through the different environments and how we may sustainably support this environment. So in our critical zone observatory, we are taking a wide variety of measurements. So the top left is a fiber optic cable that goes down to 100 meters. We have weather stations. We have flown aircrafts to collect LiDAR data. We put instruments out in the stream. We have a flux tower measurements, something like 45 variables, maybe more, being measured in there. We have done rainfall runoff experiments, basically through artificial rain. And then we have collected samples, send them to laboratories for analysis, and then have data. So the range and the diversity of these data, going from the chemistry to water, real-time feed versus laboratory analysis, is pretty involved. And so this is where we use the Clowder. So we have been working with NCSA together, and they have been leveraging a lot of the projects that have been going on and basically helping us with management of the data. I'm going to turn it over to Luigi.
All right. So here's a list of some of the physical quantities that we're tracking. The stuff at the top is data that comes directly from the sensors in the field. So these are observatories. So they have, the projects have sensors in the field. And so using some data loggers and over the cell network, we get these streams coming in. We also have a lot of data, like there was a picture of a plane in the slide before where they've taken LiDAR data over 2 of the main areas. This is pretty large data. There's about 3 terabytes of this data that was uploaded to Clowder. There is results of lab analysis, GIS data. And so our task is to take all this data and put it somewhere, make it available, and share it with other users and other collaborators and anyone who might be interested. So the way we have been managing this is that all the raw data, all of this that you have seen, everything goes into Clowder. Because Clowder is so generic, it's file-based, metadata. And a subset of that is somewhat time series oriented. That one we extract from these files. I'll show you an example in a second, and we put in these geo dashboards that give you kind of a web-based dashboard view, visualize the data, so you can just go to the website and see the data almost in real time. So this is an example of this is the data logger for the flux tower that Praveen mentioned. So it's a bunch of instruments on the flux tower plus a soil probe next to it. And as you can see, there's 158 columns of numbers that come over the data logger every 15 minutes. And of that, we take the raw files and they go into Clowder, where people can get to them, right? We have had people interested in this data ask for an account. They go in there and they take the raw data and they just download it and they can do research on it. But also we do this geodashboard thing, which I'll show you in a second. So one of the interesting things that came out of this process working with the community is that Clowder, as you know, it's very much kind of create the data sets and the spaces as you go. And originally, that actually didn't work out as well as we thought it would be, because it was actually very confusing for people to know where the data was. So one of the interesting things that we did as part of this project is we actually put a structure on Clowder. And so at the top here, you see kind of space collections, data sets. These are like Clowder-specific concepts. But then when you see in the column is actually like domain-specific, meaningful things for the scientists. So you start with like surface water, then you go quantity, the type of quantity, and then you get to a data set, and then there is raw and process folders. So this was kind of an interesting aspect with using Clowder for this particular use case. Another interesting aspect of using Clowder for this particular use case was that as part of a project with Praveen with EarthCube, NSF EarthCube, is that we worked a lot on semantics and control vocabularies that have been mentioned already by David. And so we have all these abilities of actually defining these control vocabularies within the Clowder interface, and we have been improving this over time. And so the users themselves can say, well, these are my control vocabularies. This is what I want the collaborators to establish on data sets. And then you get results that are much more controlled. We have a suite of Python extractors that do this. Here's the CSV file. Now you become like data points inside this dashboard. And we learned a lot by doing that. So this is what it looks like when that Flux Tower CSV file ends up in the dashboard. So it looks like this. Here is a site. Out of 150 columns, there's 23 instruments. You get some nice visualization on the GUI, and each instrument has a bunch of parameters. And then when you zoom out, you start seeing all these locations on the dashboard. And all of this has been so far driven by an API inside Clowder. I don't know why it advanced. But now we're taking this outside and kind of, I can talk a little bit about the reasons why and making it a standalone service. But as part of IML, we also started working on different ways of slicing and dicing all these sites. You can search and you can filter. And there is a true API. So you see the UI, but a user like the Clowder API that some of you have used in the past, there's actually endpoints, there's actually endpoints where you can get the individual data points and all the metadata about all the data points and the sites and the streams and all of that as JSON APIs. We're working on a version 3, which is updated, has better graphs, better scalability, and all of that. This will come out soon. And this is technology that we have deployed for two other projects, Great Lakes 2 Golf and Great Lakes Monitoring. So now we have, can I change this real quick? Sorry. Here we go. Much better. All right. And so we have other projects, and what you can see here, a lot of different ways of visualizing these data points, and we can create, now we can create easily more visualizations around that. So in terms of extractors, we talked about extractors a lot. So Praveen's lab has been doing all sort of interesting stuff that we have made into extractors as part of Brown Dog. So this is an extractor that identifies floodplains using a digital elevation model and a shapefile. We're now using Extractor to do publication. I'll talk a little bit about publication later on. But basically, as part of the Critical Zone Observatory Network, they're using quasi-HydroShare as kind of the publishing endpoint where all the final data products go in. So we're working on ways from Clowder to kind of publish to HydroShare. We did this as part of the SEED project. I'll touch upon this a little bit later on, but this is kind of some of our current work. We're also looking at physical variable annotation. You upload a file, and what it does is an extractor is able to try to guess what the headers are based on a database of mappings. So what you see on the left, the headers are site ID, date and time, discharge, but the mappings are start name, discharge CMS, and name, and these are actual standard vocabularies. Behind the scenes, they have a full URI. And finally, we're looking right now, this is brand new, Sandeep has started working on this, is given to CSV file, if you have the standard annotation, if you know exactly what the columns are, can you actually aggregate the two so you get a file that represents data from, for example, different sites, all done through the extraction bus. And this is just an example of it. Needed, we have been working on and talking about using these parsers that create data points that go into the geodashboard as extractors. We're also talking about more previewers and visualizations, and also in the Clowder UI versus the dashboard, and more visualization in the dashboard. Unique contributions given to Clowder. We definitely have, as part of this effort, we've been improving the geodashboard quite a bit. We have a UI in Clowder to manage the sensors, so users can actually define those. And we've been working with this idea of having links and relationships between resources in Clowder, which I'll talk a little bit about later on in kind of our technical session. So that's it. So any questions? If not,
Yeah,
oh, please. Yes, please. Hi.
So you made a comment about having to, or deciding to move it out of
Yes.
Clowder. Could
Yeah.
you elaborate a little bit
Yeah.
why and
Yeah, sure.
how does that impact?
Yeah, so Clowder, as a lot of it, inside Clowder, there's a lot of APIs, there's a lot of functionality, and we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do in terms of hardening the software. But the geodashboard itself, the API that was about data points, was very unique about certain use cases. And so it was really hard to maintain that and move that along because we were tied into all the other requirements for all the other features. And one of the things that Clowder does really well, at least we think it does really well, is that it's not one monolithic piece of code. And so we have different services that are talking to each other and they're working in tandem. So we thought that it would be a good fit in this case to take that particular API, just kind of move it out and still have the two communicate, but instead of being one code base or being in the core, it would just be something, an extension that lives outside. Yeah, and I can tell you a little bit more about some of the specifics if you're interested in terms of the technology behind. So for example, we use a PostGIS database, and that's specific to the API, but then you have dependency on those libraries and all of that. Yeah. So, but it is part of the ecosystem, and I think we should start thinking about that, about the ecosystem of tools around Clowder, not just Clowder core.
There's a question there, and then was there a question there? Yeah.
Yes, please.
So you were talking about LiDAR data sets, and you were talking about other, the Flux data set. That in itself, the raw data,
Yeah.
it's really messy and need a lot of processing.
Yeah.
So did you integrate that processing level into Clowder for the CSOs too, or is people still running separate software to get the data to a stage where you can get it into the Clowder?
We actually, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, lot of the processing, so it's a two-stage. When we were working with the data, we're developing those processing capabilities, and some of those processing capabilities are being digested as part of Brown Dog, but not all of them as yet.
Yeah, but everything, what's in the Flux Tower, the LiDAR, everything, the raw files go into Clowder, and then there's different things that happen depending.
Really?
Yeah, hi.
So it might be more on the technical side. So you have a big collection of files, and
Yeah.
some of these are CSV files.
Yeah.
And you have a large collection of extractors, and some of them work on CSV files.
Yeah.
How do you match exactly extractors
Yeah.
with?
Yes, that's a great question. So as many of you might know, one of the ways you trigger extraction on files is by MIME type, but obviously CSV is very generic. So inside the extractor, we can do some checks because the extractor themselves have full access to the API. And so you can get metadata on the files to help you define that or understand that. And same thing on the data set. So for example, I didn't show this, but we have data set, we have the ability, and that we built for this project, we have the ability of associating data sets with sensor sites as defined in the dashboard. And so the extractor knows that the data set is data for that site, and so it can then use that knowledge. TerraF has a similar issue where basically there's extractors that get almost like every file coming through, but then they have logic that says, well, I'm going to ignore all of these, and I'm going, to do specific things with the ones that I better understand. So even though it's MIME type driven, it's really not. You're looking at, as long as you have enough information around the file, then you're in a good place. If you don't, then yes, there isn't much you can do. Yeah. So that's something that we're still developing moving forward. So I mentioned it in the last slide. So we have some work going in that area that would be interesting to chat about. Yeah. All right, thank you very much. All right, sorry.